Begin today the Gemara on Daf Chof Aleph. We're going to start at the first line where it says the Tanya. We learned already a little over here, but we're going to start again from the Tanya. This is the middle of an inyan. This is continuing from a brisa that was brought on Daf Chof, where the brisa quotes the pasuk where it says V'chol karben min chascha b'melech timloch, that you have to put salt on the carbon min chascha. Now, regarding that pasuk, the Gemara explained before that there's a klal, a prat, a klal. That it starts with the word carbon. That means every carbon has to be salted. Then it says min chascha, that means only a mincha. Then at the end of the pasuk it says again, kol karbancha. What do we learn from this? That has to be similar to the prat. Just like the prat, which is the mincha, needs wood in order to burn it on the mizbeach, so too, only something that needs wood has to be salted as well. And the Brisa said before, that excludes wood itself that would be brought as a carbon, or blood that's sprayed on the Mizbeach. They do not need any salt. But the Gemara on Avchaf Amud Beis proved that according to Rebbe, and the Gemara explained that this Brisa is following Rebbe's opinion, when you bring wood itself as a carbon, you bring 2 logs of wood as a carbon, the wood itself has a din of a carbon gomor, it's 100% a carbon, and it actually has to be salted. So therefore the Gemara here said that we're not excluding salt, we're not excluding wood, that is, rather we're excluding nisachim. That the nisachim, when you pour the wine on the mizbeach that comes along with karbanis, the wine does not have to be salted. Okay, so here the Gemara brings the Brisa, which is the source for this. The Tanya, it says in the Brisa, Avol hayayin, the wine that's poured on the mizbeach, v'hadam, blood, v'ha'etzim, and wood, v'akteires, and the ketores that's burnt on the inside of Mizbeach, ein tu'unin melach, they do not need salt. So regarding the Brisa before, it's excluding blood does not need salt, and wine does not need salt. Okay, but now the Gemara focuses on this Brisa here and explains, Mani, who is the Tana that is teaching this Brisa that we just read? Rebbe, if the Tana of this Brisa would be the opinion of Rebbe, it can't be. Kashya eitzim, then in this Brisa where it says that wood brought as a carbon for itself does not have to be salted, that's not Rebbe's opinion. The Gemara before said on Daf Chof, Rebbe holds that a carbon eitzim, if someone is donating just wood, it's a carbon gomer, it's 100% a carbon and it does need salt. Rabbanon, so if this Brisa would be the opinion of the Rabbanon that argue with Rebbe, but Kashya ketores, then the question would be, here it says that ketores does not have to be salted, but before, in the Brisa on Chof Amud Aleph, the Gemara said that ketores does have to be salted, because ketores, when it's burnt on the inside Mizbeach, it needs wood to burn it, and therefore it does have to be salted. So who is the Tana of this Brisa? Says the Gemara, Hai Tana hu, it's the following Tana here, it's a third Tana. And he has a different interpretation. What we do with this drasha, as I mentioned before, in the language of the pasuk, there's a klal, a prat, a klal. So the Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Shmuel ben Noish, Rabbi Yechanan ben Breka Imer, I learn out from this klal, a prat, a klal, that I compare to the mincha in the following way, different than what we said before. And I say, Ma prat mefurish davar shemekabel tumah. The prat, the mincha, is something that is susceptible to become tummy. And v'oil li'ishim, it's brought and burnt in the fire in the mizbeach. And v'yeshnei al mizbeach achitzen. And where, on which mizbeach is it burnt? On the outside mizbeach. Av kol, so too, these are the details that I'm comparing. Kol dava, anything a makabel tumah is susceptible to tumah v'oil li'ishim and goes onto the fire v'yeshnei al mizbeach achitzen, and it's on the outside mizbeach, this is what has to be salted. Now, what do we exclude based on all these details? Yatsu eitzim. We exclude wood because she'em mekablim tumah. Wood, logs of wood, do not become tummy. And Rashi here actually adds that regarding the logs of wood that are brought in the mizbeach, the Gemara in Pesachim says that it is mekabel tumah, but that's only midrabanan. When I tell you, it's not mekabel tumah. And yatsu dam v'yayin. Then we also exclude blood and wine. She'ein el li'ishim. They do not go onto the fire, and therefore they don't have to be salted. And yotze ketores, we also exclude the ketores, she'eino al mizbeach achitzen. It's not on the outside of mizbeach, it's on the inside mizbeach. So this is the Brisa that we said before. It's Rabbi Shmuel ben Noish, Rabbi Yechanan ben Breka, that he says that both the eitzim and the ketores do not have to be salted. Okay, now the Gemara goes back to another detail that was mentioned before regarding blood. The Brisa, the Gemara brought before, said that when it comes to blood, how do you know it does not have to be salted? Because in the Lashon of the pasuk it says, "Lesashbes melach bris alekecha me'al mincha secha," and we say that it's only from mincha secha, but from the blood you do not have to salt it. So now the Gemara asks on that. So now the only reason we know that blood does not have to be salted is because of the drasha of this pasuk, and it excludes blood. But if not for this drasha, hava minute, then I would say dam liboy melach, that the blood sprayed on the mizbeach also has to be salted. But the question on this is, how could that be? Kivin the malche, if he would salt it, nafik lei mitayres dam, it does not have anymore the status of blood, and therefore it should not be qualified to even do the zrika of this dam on the mizbeach. What's the source for this? Because the Amaziri, Amar Abchanine, Dam Shabishlei, blood that was cooked. Eino over olive. You're not over on the Isser of eating blood. Now, the Isser of eating blood, whether it's Chulin blood, whether it's Kachin blood, once it's cooked and it's not fit to be spread in the Mizbeach, so then you're not over eating from it. Because Rashi here brings that the Isser of eating blood, to be Chayiv Kares from it, is only in a case where it's blood that's roy to be used as a kapara to be spread on the mizbeach. So once it's cooked, so it can't be spread on the mizbeach, and therefore you're not over on it. And Rav Yehuda, Rav Yehuda said it the name of Ziri, that dam shemalchai, not only if it's cooked, but even blood that was salted, ain't over olav. You're not over if you drink from this blood. Once you salt the blood, it's like somewhat cooked. It's a meliach kereseach. It becomes, it changes the nature of the blood, and you're not over on it. And Rav Yehuda Didei Omar, Rav Yehuda, he added another detail about this, which is not really connected to the point that we're discussing here. He says, Averim, Shetzalam, the limbs of karbanes that he roasted before he took it onto the Mizbeach, and Vehelam, and then he brought them to be burnt on the Mizbeach, Ein be'em mishum l'reich nichayach. You're not fulfilling the mitzvah of reich nichayach, that it has to be the aroma of the karbanes from roasting it on the Mizbeach. Once it was roasted before, you're not going to fulfill that mitzvah. Okay, but the point, the Gemara's question over here is, why is it necessary to have a pasuk to exclude blood from being salted? If it's salted, it wouldn't qualify to be sprayed on the mizbeach. Answers the Gemara, I would think, mishtaba mashu lemitzvah ba'alma, that you should just put a little bit of blood a little bit of salt, that is, into the blood for the mitzvah. Not to the point that it should be like salted, that it should change the nature of the blood. Meliach keriseh, a little bit of blood. Again, a little bit of salt. So, Kamash Malan, that's why we need the pasuk to say that mi'al minchascha, that only on the mincha there's salting, but not from the blood. Okay, so the Gemara here goes a little bit off on a side point now regarding blood that was brought up here. Gufa, so to go back to this point itself that was mentioned, Omar Zeiri, Omar Abchanine, Dam Shebishlei. Blood that was cooked. Eino over olav, you're not over on the issur of drinking blood. Yosef Rava v'kamar lo hashmaite. So Rava was saying over this halacha that he said. So Abaye asked him from what it says in the following brayse. Hikva es adam. If you congeal the blood, and that's by cooking it. When you cook it, so the blood gets congealed, and then va'achloi, and then he ate it. Oy shehimcha es achelev, or the forbidden fats that were cooked and then that melts v'gamoy, and he drank it. Chayiv, he will be chayiv. So I see here regarding the blood that even after it's cooked, it's congealed, you're still going to be chayiv. So how does the Iri say that if you cook the blood, he's not over? And says the Gemara loy kashya, it's not a contradiction. Kan shehikva ba'ur, over here it's where it was congealed by fire, and kan shehikva b'chama, and over here it was congealed by sunlight. And the Gemara explains, ba'ur loy hadar. Once it's congealed by cooking by a fire, then the condition of the blood remains as is, it becomes congealed, and it doesn't go back to its condition before. It's here that Zaidi said that if you eat from it, you're not over. However, b'chama, if it was affected by sunlight, hadar, it goes back to its original condition of being liquidy, and therefore, you're going to be over. And that's what the Bryce was talking about. But even if this happened, that in the sunlight it became affected, it became congealed, even in the sunlight, leme, once that happens, even if it's temporary, and it returns back to become liquidy afterwards, but why wouldn't I say, hoyol ve'itchi, that once it was rejected of being used to spray as a blood, for a carbon, so then it's rejected. And even if it goes back to being liquidy, it cannot be used again. So if that's the case, once it can't be used as a carbon, so then you should not be over on this if you drink from it as well, because you're only over on the blood that's roy for a kapara. And the Gemara brings this halacha because the Habai Minei Rabmani Yechanan, Rabmani asked this question from Rabbi Yechanan, Dam Shekarash, the blood that was congealed, Va'achloi, and he ate from it. Mahu, what's the halacha regarding this? So and he answered, Amalei, hoyol v'nitche yitche. Once it was rejected, it gets rejected, and it's not fit anymore to be sprayed in the mizbeach. So why are you making a distinction between the blood that was congealed by cooking, fire, or it was congealed by sunlight? So Ishtik, that is, Rave, was quiet. He didn't have what to answer Abaye. Malay. So then Abaye said, I can answer the contradiction we had before regarding the blood that congealed. Zeiri said that you're not over, and the Braisa says that you are. I can give you a different answer. Dilma, I can tell you, and the Bach takes out the word Vadai, Kam b'chatois achitzainis. Over here it's talking about the chatois that are sprayed on the outside Mizbeach. Over here, even if it's congealed, it's still fit to be sprayed on the Mizbeach, and you'll be over if you drink from it, as the Gemara is going to explain in a moment. And Kam b'chatois apnimiyos. And when the Zeiri said that you're not going to be over, it's from the blood that of the karbonis chatas that are sprayed on the inside mizbeach. There, once it congeals, it's actually not fit to be sprayed, and therefore you won't be over. So now here the Gemara explains what's the source of this distinction. So Amar, when Rava heard this answer of Abaye, so Rava himself explained it, and he said, "At karton milse the Amar Rav Chisda." You reminded me something that Rav Chisda said. What did Rav Chisda say? Dam shekorash, blood that became congealed. The chatois, and some out over here, hachitzonius. That's what it's talking about here. By the chatois that are sprayed on the outside mizbeach. So this blood, va'acholoi, if you went and ate it, chayiv, you will be chayiv for this. Why? Because this is still blood that's fit to be sprayed on the mizbeach. Because regarding the chatois, hachitzonius, what's the language of the pasuk? The lokach v'nosan omerachmana. The Torah says, take from this blood and place it on the mizbeach. So v'hai bar lekiche unesinahu. This terminology of lokach and nosan could even be applied if the blood congealed. So therefore, it's still fit to be put on the mizbeach, and you'll be over if you eat or drink from it. However, if it's the bloods of the chatos that go on the inside mizbeach, v'achole, and you ate from it after it congealed, potter. Here it'll be potter. Why? Because the Torah uses a different terminology. The Torah says, dip your finger inside the vessel of the blood, and then you spray from it. And so that v'hai lav bar tefila v'azohu. Once it congeals, you can't apply this terminology of dipping and spraying. And so you'll be potter for this. That's the distinction between these two karbanis and what the Zeiri said and what the Braisa said, whether you'll be over or not. Now, however, the Gemara here says, Rava didei amar. Rava disagrees with this distinction of Chisda said. Rava himself says that afile b'chatois apnimiyos, that even regarding the bloods of the inside chatois, v'acholei, and he ate from it after it's congealed, chayiv. He still will be chayiv. Why? If this is not fit to be sprayed on the mizbeach once it congeals, why would he be chayiv for this? Hoyol ukenegdoi roi b'chatois achatzainis. Since similar, this blood that congeals regarding the chatois that are placed on the outside mizbeach, there it is fit to go on the mizbeach even after it congeals. So that's already enough to be considered that it's fit to go on mizbeach, that you'd be chayiv for this. Even though regarding this specific blood here, it's not fit to be placed on the inside mizbeach. Now, based on this, Rav Papa takes this a step further, and he says, Hilkach, if so, you're using this svara of hoyel, since there's blood similar that could go on the mizbeach, so even this blood that can't go on the inside mizbeach, you're going to be chayiv for this. So Hilkach, I could say, dam chamer shakarash. If you have another negative here, that it's not only blood that congealed, but it's the blood of a donkey. It's not kosher animal that is not fit for the mizbeach at all, and it also congealed. V'acholoi, and he ate from it. Chayiv, you will be chayiv. This is a kind of blood that's not at all fit to go on the mizbeach. But hoyel ukenegdoi roi b'chatois achitzainis, since there is a kind of blood like this, similar to this, also from an animal that could go on the outside mizbeach, you'll be chayiv. So therefore, this is blood from an animal, even if it's from a non-kosher animal, but it's still similar to an animal that could be sprayed on the mizbeach, and you'll be chayiv for eating from this. That's how far this svara of hoyel goes. The Gemara concludes here regarding the blood. Amar Rav Gidl, different subject regarding blood. Rav Gidl said, but Amar Zeiri, also in the name of Zeiri, that dam, when it comes to blood, ben lach, ben yavish, whether it's moist, whether it's dried, chaitzitz, if it's on the person's skin, it'll be a chatzitze, a separation regarding when he's toiveling in the mikveh. So Meisvei, the Gemara asks from what it says in the Braisa here, At Hadam, the Raisa lists the things that create a chatzitza. So it says blood, v'adyoi, and ink, v'advash, honey, v'cholov, milk, yivation. When they're dry, chaytzitzin. So they create a chatzitza. Lachin, however, if it's moist, ain't a chaytzitzin. They're not a chatzitza. So how does Rav Gidl say in the name of Ziri that it doesn't make a difference? Moist or dry, regarding the blood, it will be a chatzitza. And says the Gemara, loy kashe, it's not a contradiction. Ha, the sarech. When Rav Gidl said that it will be a chatzitza, even if it's moist, that's because it's already sticky. It's moist, but it's beginning to dry. That will be a chatzitza. Ha, the loy sarech. But if it's not sticky, and you can just sort of pull it off, or you go in the mikveh and it's just liquid and it comes off, that's something that will not be a chatzitza. Okay, now the Gemara returns to the halachas of salting the karbonis. That's the sugya that we're learning here. So now, in the lashon of the pasuk it says timlach. So the lashon the pasuk there says leisashbis melach bris lekecha. Before that, the lashon of the pasuk is v'chol karbon min chascha b'melach timlach. Okay, so now the word timlach lamay yaso. It says melach timlach. There's two expressions here. So when it says timlach, what is that coming to teach? Says the Gemara, look at the Tanya. So we learned in the Braisa when it says ba melach that it has to be with salt. Yachol, I would think tivoi nehu, that you should do tivoi nehu, which the Gemara is soon going to explain. So tamud loymar timlach. So therefore the pasuk says no at timlach. Okay. Now eat timlach. If the pasuk would say just the term of timlach, so yachol, I would think that means that it has to be made to be salty. That would be even b'mei melach. You could use salt water or like a thick pasty salt water. That would be good enough. It doesn't have to be actual salt. Talmud loymar ba melach. It has to be salted with actual salt. Okay, that's what we learned from this part of the pasuk. Now afterwards the pasuk says v'lei sashbis melach. What does this mean? Do not cease from salt. This means have melach. What kind of salt do you bring? Bring the type of salt she'ena sheveses. Salt that is always there. It's always available in all seasons. Ve'ezuzu, which salt is this? Melach sedoimis. It's the salt of Yamamelach, I guess, of the salt from the Sedaim. So the water that comes on the banks and it evaporates there, and you always have salt available there. Rashi says in all seasons, winter, summer, there's always salt that's available. And that's what means loisashpis. It's describing also the nature of the salt that's always available. Now, ominayim, but how do you know shimlei matzah melech zaymes, that if you don't find that kind of salt, shemevi melech is truknis, that you bring melech is truknis, which is a different kind of salt that you have to get from inside the ground. You have to mine it, and it's more coarse, this salt. Talmud loymar takriv. The pasuk says that takriv, the language of the pasuk is al kol karbancha takriv melach. Takriv means takriv kolshu, any kind of salt that's available. That's what you bring. And another thing we say, the word takriv is telling me mikol mokim. You can bring the salt from any place, not only from in Eretz Yisrael, but also from Chutz La'aretz. And takriv also tells me that vafilu b'Shabbos, that this is an aveda that's done even on Shabbos. And takriv means afilu b'tumah. It's done even in a time of impurity. So Rashi explains what we're saying here is we're talking about a carbon sibur. A carbon sibur is deicha Shabbos and it's deicha tumah, and therefore salting the karbonis is a real aveda, and therefore it's deicha Shabbos and it's deicha tumah as well. Till here's the Braisa. So now the Gemara goes back to explain the term that the Braisa used, that if we would say the word timloch, if we would say the word bamelach, then I would think tevay neyo. Says the Gemara, "My tevaneyo." What does this word mean when it says tevaneyo? Amar Rabba Barola hachi kamar. This is what it's saying. Yachol yizbainenu ketevim betit. That I would think that you have to mix in salt the way you mix in the teven, the straw, in when you make cement. And you mix in a lot of straw. So over here as well, you would think that you have to have a lot of salt on the pieces of the carbon. That's what it means. Tevaneyo is the word yizbainenu, from the teven that's mixed in. Amalei Abaye, but Abaye says it can't be that's what the Braisa is saying, because Yichachi, if that's the case, he's bainanu mi baile. The Braisa should have said that expression, this word. So Elam Abaye, therefore Abaye says Yochel. What the Braisa is saying is, I would think Yasenu Kibinyan, that you have to have so much salt that it should be like a structure, like you're building salt on top of the limb of the carbon. That's the amount of salt. But Rava rejects this pshat as well. He says, yivnanu mi bayile. For building, the right term to be used is yivnanu. I would think you have to build up the salt on the piece of the carbon. So therefore Rava says, yachel tevu nehu. The way to read it is, I would think tevu nehu. My tuvunahu, what does this word mean? Amar Rav Ashi, Yochol yitim by tam kibina. I would think that you have to give it a flavor of salt like bina, just like a person's bina, a person's understanding. It gives him a flavor, meaning that if a person has some level of understanding, so then it affects his decision making, that it gives a flavor to him being able to make decisions and understand things. So to here, I would think you just have to put a flavor of salt. So according to what many Rishonim say, now the shot of the Gemara changes. Until here we thought that Tuvaneum basically is saying you would think that you have to put a lot of salt. Now it's saying the opposite. You can have a little flavor, you could just put a little bit of salt, like bina, that gives a flavor in a person. Tamad loima timlach. Therefore the pasuk says the word timlach, that it has to be properly salted, which means actually not too much and not too little. What do you do? Maybe ha'ever, you bring the limb of the piece of the carbon, the nice and olive melach, you place salt in it on one side, then you turn it over, the nice and olive melach, and you place salt on the other side, umaleyu, and then you can bring it on to the mizbeach to burn. Amar Abaye says, v'chein l'kedera. Similar, it's also when it comes to the meat that you want to eat and it has to be salted to get out the blood, you have to salt it on both sides, and more than that is not necessary. In a brayse we learned, melach shal gabe ha'ever, the salt that is on the actual limb of the carbon that you just salted. Ma'ilim bay. That's something that if you have any benefit from it, the din of me'ilah applies here. Shal gabe kevesh, but if the salt that is on the ramp after you salted, and there's leftover salt that fell onto the ramp of the mizbeach, that's where they salted the pieces of the karbanis, or salt that was left over that fell onto the top of the mizbeach, they salted the karbanis mincha there and other things on the top of the mizbeach. Over there, once it was used already, so that there's no din of meal on this. Rav Masna said, "My kara, what's the pasuk that the salt that's on the piece of the carbon, on that you will be moil?" Because the pasuk describes the salting, and it says ve'krafta lufnei Hashem, you bring it for Hashem. Ve'shlicha hakayanim aleim melach, and they throw salt on the carbon, and ve'helo oisam oila Hashem, and then you bring it up as an oila. So when it says the term oila, that term is said on the piece with the salt. The salt is also not called an oila Hashem. So if it's called oila Hashem, then if you have a benefit of this, the din of meila will apply. Okay, so now here the Gemara brings more regarding the salt. It was mentioned before, the salt on the ramp, the salt on top of the mizbeach. So now Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah Masechta Shkolim, it says as follows, that this is that Mishnah there lists different conditions that Bezdin made regarding for the Kainim in the Beis HaMikdash. And one of these things is regarding what we're talking about here, ala melach, regarding the salt, and va'ala eitzim, and regarding the wood in the Beis HaMikdash, sheyu kainim ne'esim behen, that the kainim can have benefit of the salt and the wood. So now, Alma Shmuel explains, leishanu ela lekarbana, regarding the salt, what it's saying is that the kainim can have hana for their karbanis, avala achile loy, but for eating they can't have hana from this salt. So the Gemara explains, what was Shmuel saying? So at this point we think what Shmuel is saying is, my lekarbana, what does it mean that the kainim could use the salt for their karbanis? It means limlayach karbanam. They could use the salt to salt their karbanis. Now when it said that la'achila, that for eating they can't, it means la'achilas kachim. When they eat from the kachim, they can't salt their meat for eating from the salt of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so that's what we think Shmuel is saying. In fact, the Gemara, how could that be the Pshat in Shmuel's words? We use the salt from the Beis HaMikdash. We give it to the Kainim for them to salt the hides of the animals that goes to the Kainim. In order to the tan, the hides, you have to have the salt, and they can use the salt. So for eating kachim, we're not going to give Kainim to salt the meat that they eat. What's the source of this? Because the Tanya, we learned in Abraise, and it comes out, you say like this, the salt in the Beis HaMikdash was in 3 different locations. The Lishkas HaMelach, there was salt that was in a chamber where the salt is kept. Then Valgabe HaKevesh, then there's the salt that's on the ramp, and then the salt that's on top of the Mizbeach. What are these 3 things? The Lishkas HaMelach, the salt that was in the chamber of salt, Shesham Melchin Oides Kachim. That's where they salted the hides of the karbanis. Al Gabi Kevesh, the salt that was on the ramp, Shesham Melchin Eseivarim. That's where they salted the limbs of the karbanis animals. B'rosh Sham Mizbeach. Then the salt that's on top of the Mizbeach, Shasham Melchin HaKaimitz, the kaimitz of the mincha, the alavayna, the frankincense as well from the mincha, they were salted on top of the mizbeach, and v'akteires, ketores as well was salted there, according to the opinion that says that it was salted. U'minchas kainim, minchas kayim Mashiach, minchas nesachim. These are three kinds of minchas that have to be completely burnt on the mizbeach. And v'oila sa'if, the oila sa'if that is done on top of the mizbeach was burnt, was salted there as well. And that was the salt on top of the mizbeach. Okay, so what's the Gemara's question? So we see here that the Kohanim were allowed to use the salt to salt the hides. So for sure they're allowed to use salt to salt the meat that they're eating. How could he say that Shmuel meant to say that they can't use it for eating? So therefore the Gemara says, Ella, then we should say as follows, Mai lekarbanim. What did Shmuel mean when he said that they can use the salt for their carbon? That means lachilas karbanim. Yeah, that they can use the salt when they're eating from the meat of the carbon. Now, my lachila, and then when Shmuel said, but for eating, they cannot salt, what does that mean? Achila de chulin. That means if they're eating any other meat, which is chulin, not karbanis, there they can't salt. But the Gemara asks on this, why does Shmuel have to let me know this? Chulin, if they're eating chulin, pshita. Obviously they can't salt chulin. Ma ba hasam. What's chulin doing inside the azara that I would think that they could salt the chulin from the salt of the Beis HaMikdash? Okay, so the Gemara explains, no, there is actually a reason that I would have thought that you could salt the chulin that Kohanim eat. Because, although the master said, the pasuk says, yoichlo, that they eat from the karbanis. So actually it says in the lashon of the pasuk, in the beginning of the pasuk it says, when he said, yoichlu aran banav, they eat. And the end of the pasuk it uses a little bit of a different term, yoichlu ha, they eat it. So in the end of the pasuk, when it says yichlu ah, it's mashma that they eat only the kachim. When it says yoichlu, without that emphasis of eating it, it means they eat along with other things. And what does that mean? Sheyoichlu ima chulin utruma, that in cases where there's not enough meat, they should eat along with the meat of the karbanis. They should also eat from chulin and truma. Why? Kidei shetehei necheles ala sayda. When you eat kachim, the meat of the kachim should be eaten in the most best way possible, and that's when you're eating that meat when you're getting full. Just like a similar halacha is regarding the carbon pesach. Right, so therefore, over here, Kohanim, many times before they ate from the meat of the karbanis, they would eat, well, obviously outside of the azara, they would eat from chulin or from truma. So if so, you would think that maybe they could use that salt to salt the chulin and the truma that they are eating for the purpose of then eating from the kachim. Obviously, they're going to have to take the salt outside the azara, not bringing the chulin into azara. So afilahachi. So this is what Shmuel had to tell me that no, that nevertheless we say melach the kachim lo yavinu lahu. We don't give the salt of the kachim to salt the chulin that they're eating when they're coming to prepare to eat from the kachim. So that's the pshat in what Shmuel said. Okay, so we have here two options to explain what Shmuel said. The first option the Gemara said is that it's coming to tell me that Kohanim are allowed to use the salt to salt their karbanis, but not to eat the meat of their karbanis. And now the Gemara says no. The pshat is that they can use the salt for salting the meat of their karbanis, but not to salt the chulin. So the Gemara says in this, Ravina says, Ravashi, Hochanami Mistavra. This second pshat, it's logical to say that this is the correct pshat in what Shmuel was saying. Because that when Shmuel said that they can use it for their karbanis, that doesn't mean to eat, but it means to salt their karbanis. Why does Shmuel have to say this? And that this is the pshat in that Mishnah there. Time the Asni Bezdin. So that would mean he's explaining the Mishnah that this is a special condition that the Bezdin makes, that the Kohanim are allowed to use from the salt to salt their karbanis. What do you need a special condition for this? Asni Bezdin loy. Without that condition, they could not salt their karbanis from the salt of the Beis HaMikdash. Why not? Hashte Yisrael Yavinon. For every Yid that brings a carbon, he doesn't have to bring his own salt. It's the salt of the Beis HaMikdash that we give every Yid to salt his karbanis. For a Kohen, you're not going to give from the salt of the Beis HaMikdash to salt it. Why not? Now here, the Gemara is going to bring the source in a braise. Where do we see this idea? Maybe a Yid has to bring his own salt for his karbanis. So the Gemara brings a long braise that explains the source for this, that a Yid does not have to bring salt for his own carbon. So the Tanya, we learned in a braise, it says as follows. Yochel, I would think to say, mincha. Person says, I'm going to bring a carbon mincha. So Yavi melach mitoch beisa. He's donating the carbon mincha. Along with that donation, he has to bring salt as well. Just like when you donate a mincha, along with it you have to bring the levaina as well. And I would say, vidinu, I could compare it in the following way. Nemar, hevi mincha vehevi melach. The Torah says that when you have to bring a mincha, when you donate a mincha, and it says that you bring salt. That's the psukim that we had before about bringing salt. And v'nema, the Torah also says, hevi mincha vehevi levaina, that when you bring a mincha, you have to bring levaina with it. So I could compare ma levaina mitoich beisai, just like when you bring a mincha, the levaina, you also have to donate from your home. Af melach mitoich beisai. Maybe every time you bring a carbon, you have to bring your own salt to salt the carbon mincha. That's one way you could say to compare to the levaina. Oh, the Braisa goes on to say, maybe I would say an opposite svara. Klach lederech zu. Maybe we should go in another direction and compare in the following way. Namar hevi mincha vehevi melach. The Torah says that you bring a carbon mincha and you also have to bring salt. And v'nema hevi mincha vehevi eitzim. The Torah also says that when you bring a carbon mincha, you have to have wood to burn your carbon on this on this wood. The pasuk says ala eitzim asher ala eish. So I should compare to wood. Ma eitzim mishal tzibor. Just like when it comes to wood, who provides the wood? That comes from the tzibor. You don't have to bring your own wood. Af melach mishal tzibor. So too the salt has to come from the tzibur. You don't have to bring your own salt. So we have two ways what to compare the salt to, either to the levaina or to the wood. So the Braisa goes on to say, let's see what it's more logical to compare to. So on one hand, I could say, Danin davar hanoyeg b'chol hazvachim midavar hanoyeg b'chol hazvachim. I should compare something that is by all karbanis from something that's by all karbanis. So that is the salt that is by all karbanis that have to be salted, and I compare it to the wood that has to be used to burn all karbanis. But I should now learn out from the levaina that does not happen by all other karbanis. That's one svara. Or the Braisa goes on to say, logically I could say the opposite. Or maybe go in the opposite direction. Let's learn out the halacha of the salt from the levaina. Why? Because let's learn out the salt that comes in the same vessel together with the mincha, because what do you do with the kmitza? You put the kmitza into a new vessel, and then it's in that vessel that you have to put the salt to salt it. So the salt goes into the same vessel together with the kaimitz. So I should learn this out. Midavar haba imay b'kliyachat, from the levaina that also is originally brought and placed into the same vessel together with the flour of the mincha. So there's that svara to compare them. Va'al yechichu eitzim, and you should not prove from the halacha of the wood she'ena ba mima b'kliyachat, that does not come into the same vessel. So what's the conclusion of this whole discussion? Regarding salt, I have a svara to compare to wood, I have a svara to compare to levaina, so it's not clear logically whether a person has to bring his own salt, or the Beis HaMikdash, from the funds of the Lishka of the Beis HaMikdash, we provide from the tzibur, the salt for every individual. So therefore the Braisa concludes, we have a pasuk, Talmud Laimar, by the salt, the pasuk says, Bris, Melach, Olam, Hu, that by the salt it says that it's a bris, it's a covenant. And then the pasuk says, and this is a pasuk by the Lechem Aponim, that the Lechem Aponim is brought from the tzibur, Me'eis, B'nei Yisrael, Bris, Olam. So Ma'ala Halon, just like there by the Lechem Aponim, Mishal Tzibur, this comes from the tzibur, from the funds of the tzibur, Avkan, Mishal Tzibur. So to over here, it comes from the funds of the tzibur. What funds of the tzibur does this come from? It comes from the Machzas HaShekel. The Machzas HaShekel is the funds that they bring, that they buy all karbanis tzibur from the entire year, and that includes also the salt that comes from these funds, and therefore all the Yidden use it. Okay, so what's the conclusion over here? The Gemara is saying that I see regarding any Yid that brings a carbon, he obviously uses from the salt, from the tzibur. So there's no reason to think that a kain should be any different, that he can't use from the funds of the tzibur. So obviously, when it says here in this Mishnah, and Shmuel explained it, that the kainim could use from this salt, it doesn't have to say that he can use from the salt to salt the karbanis. What it's coming to add is that he could eat from the salt. When they're eating the meat, they could salt their meat, and they don't have to bring their own salt to salt their meat. That's what it's going on. That's his proof. Oh, but the Gemara says on this, it's not necessarily a proof. Amalei Rav Mordechai Rav Ashi. So Rav Mordechai says to Rav Ashi, Hachi ka'amar Rav Sheisha bereid Rav Idi. This is what Rav Sheisha bereid Rav Idi said, that you could explain the Mishnah like we originally thought to say. That really, like the original pshat we said, that the Mishnah, according to what Shmuel said, is coming to teach that a kohen could use from the salt of the Beis HaMikdash to salt his karbanis. which comes from the machzas hashekel. He could use that for his karbanis. Your question was, what's the svara to say that he shouldn't? Why do we need a special condition of the bezin for this? Why should he be different than any other yid? So the Gemara explains it's necessary to say this according to Ben Bukhri's opinion. The point that the Gemara is going to say here, we'll see the conclusion, but just to say in the beginning here where the Gemara is going, according to Ben Bukhri, Kainim don't give machzas hashekel. So if they don't give machzas hashekel, so then there's a svara to say that they can't use from the funds of the machzas hashekel for the salt to salt their karbanis. So let's see, what's Ben Bukhri's opinion? Tanan, so we learned in the Mishnah, Rav Yehuda said, hey, Ben Bukhri be Yavne. Ben Bukhri testified in Yavne, called Kayin Sheshekel, a Kayin that gives machzas hashekel, Eino Chayte. He's not a sinner when he gives the machzas hashekel. So what he mainly means to say is that he's not obligated to give. And Rashi says the source for this is because by machzas hashekel it says kol ha'over ala pekudim, and or kol ha'over, and we learn it out from what it says kol ha'over ala pekudim. Only those that were counted, they have to bring machzas hashekel. But Shevet Levi was not counted, so they don't have to bring machzas hashekel. Okay, why he says eino chayte, the Gemara will soon explain that there would be a svara, that it would be a sin if he gives machzas hashekel. Now, Amalei Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai argues with Ben Bukhri, and he said, Loiki, that's not what it is. Ela kol kayin she'ein shoy kol chayte. A kayin that does not give machzas hashekel is sinning. He has the mitzvah and obligation like every other year to give machzas hashekel. And Rashi says that it's learned out from what it says, Zeh yitnu. Zeh is 12, and 12 means from all 12 shvatim, including Shevet Levi, has to give. And when it says kol ha'over, doesn't mean those that were counted, it means those that passed through the Kriyas Yamsuf. So everybody's obligated to give. However, the Kainim made the following mistake in a drasha of a pasuk to think that they don't have to give machzas hashekel. What was the mistake they made? The Kainim were darshan to themselves and say as follows: the halacha by a mincha, a carbon mincha that a Kain brings, there's no part of it that is eaten. That's always the rule of a carbon mincha of a kayin, that has to be completely burnt on the mizbeach. So now they said, wait a minute, it's going to be a problem if we are going to contribute to machzas hashekel. Then there's going to be a problem with the following things. So hayil v'oimer shtei alechem v'lechem aponim shalanuhi, the carbon oimer, who eats from it? The kayinim. Shtei alechem, the kayinim eat. Lechem aponim, every Shabbos, the kayinim eat. So shalanuhi, this belongs to us to eat. But he'eich nachalin, how could we eat from this? If these are all karbanis tzibur that are being brought from the funds of the machzas hashekel, if we, the kainim, contribute to this funds of the machzas hashekel, so then it's like a mincha of a kain. It comes from the funds of a kain as well. So how are we allowed to eat from this if the halacha by every mincha of a kain is that it must be totally burnt? That was the mistake that the kainim made. Okay, so now the Gemara explains. Ben Bukhri, according to Ben Bukhri's opinion, Kivin de lechatchile loy mechayev la'asuye. This is the Gemara just clarifies here the pshat in Ben Bukhri. We're going to get back to the main point that the Gemara brought this for, but the question over here is, if the kainim lechatchila do not have an obligation to give the machzas hashekel, kimaisin amichaytu. So if they give machzas hashekel, they should be sinning by this. How? Because the ma'ayil chulin la'azara. Because then it comes out that you're bringing chulin into the azara. Because then what they're giving machzas shekel, if they're not obligated, so then that funds is not machzas shekel. So then whatever you buy from it is not part of the machzas shekel. So it's chulin and azara. So the Gemara answers no. The maisi, they bring their machzas shekel umasar lahoyin litzibur. They give it over completely to the tzibur, and therefore it's not chulin azara. It's not something that belongs to them. Now it belongs totally to the tzibur, and therefore that's what Ben Bukhri meant to say. They're not obligated, but they're not chayte. They're not going to sin if they give the machzas shekel and they give over these funds as a donation completely to the tzibur. Okay, so now the Gemara explains. According to Ben Bukhri's opinion, that the kainim do not have an obligation to give machzas shekel. So now I would think to say regarding the salt, regarding the kainim using the salt to salt their karbanis, the ki zachalu rachmana li Yisrael, the islu lishka. When did the Torah say that you can use the salt of the funds that's in the lishka to salt the karbanis? That's yidden, because they are the ones that they donate. They give machzas shekel, so therefore they have a portion of this salt to be used for their karbanis. But the Kohanim, the less Lishka, the Kohanim that have no portion, they do not donate at all to the funds that are in the Lishka of Machzas HaShekel. Maybe they cannot use the funds, they cannot use the salt, which comes from the funds of Machzas HaShekel, since they did not contribute. Kamash Malan, this is what the Braisa is saying here, that the Bezdin made a condition that the Kohanim could use the salt of Karbanis. So we could still say the original Pshat. So he's refuting the raya that the Gemara brought over here. It's possible to say the original pshat that the Mishnah is saying, that they can use the salt to salt their karbanis. Yeah, according to Ben Bukhari, right.